I'm speaking with Dr. Clio Stearns today, an assistant professor of education at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, and she's a longtime elementary school teacher. Dr. Stearns is the author of several articles that turn a critical lens on social and emotional learning, or SEL programs, and taken for granted practices of understanding and mitigating children's negative emotions. She is the author of the book Critiquing Social and Emotional Learning, Psychodynamic and Cultural Perspectives, which was published by Lexington Books in 2019. Clio, I'm excited to hear from you as your research is really central to what my students overwhelmingly express as their greatest concern during field experiences, which is managing the classroom, particularly dealing with conflict and those students whose emotions and behaviors they find challenging or frustrating. So often students discuss the necessity of teaching children to appropriately express emotions, or those behaviors such as apologizing or sharing. And the belief there is that children need to have those skills so that they can succeed academically in the classroom. Can you talk to us about your perspective on SEL and what you have learned as a teacher and researcher?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thanks so much for having this conversation with me and for that nice introduction. Um, I guess I would just start by saying that it's a core belief of mine and an ongoing finding in all my research that emotional life is really complicated, right? And social life is really complicated too. And I do think there's this kind of assumption in teaching that teachers, because like we've sort of achieved a certain chronological age or whatever, somehow have the corner on understanding how people ought to feel and how people ought to behave. And what I think can be really liberating for teachers, and this comes up with my students too, is just to remember that being a teacher is a professional role, but you're also human. And you have a whole human range of emotions, right? And there is no adult that actually knows every skill about how to be a person, because that's like an unattainable goal. And usually when we think about it that way, it allows us to be a little bit more forgiving with ourselves and then in turn with our students, right? So if you remember that, like, as grown-ups in every relationship, we're really thinking about kind of how we want to be, how we feel. Sometimes we feel very uncomfortable emotions. And we do things probably every day that like we slightly wish we hadn't done, right? And we can think about the things that kids do along those lines too. It's much easier to be forgiving. Kids fight with each other. So do grown-ups every day. Every day grown-ups fight with each other. And it's like not the end of the world. The other thing I would say about that question is that this idea of managing a classroom is a flawed idea. And I know that classroom management, it's really hard to disrupt that concept because it's something that teachers worry about so deeply. And it's this like very kind of a rigid, sometimes very upsetting idea imposed from above us that we ought to manage the classroom and have it under control at all times. And, SEL, social and emotional learning, even if we buy into it as a construct, which I largely don't, but even if we do buy into the idea that social and emotional learning is important, then just stopping for a minute to think about how basically like messed up it is that social and emotional learning should be there in service of having a managed classroom. I think that's a really important thing for teachers to think about. So if we want kids to think about their feelings, to think about how they are as people, how they express themselves, how they coexist with others who might be like very different from themselves, then that's lovely. That's totally different from saying we want them to behave an exact way, right? In fact, I would argue that those things are intrinsically at odds with each other. So I think if we're going to support the idea of social and emotional growth or education, then we have to not say that like emotional learning happens in service of compliance, in service of behaving a particular way in the classroom. That said, I do think that, as teachers, it's really natural to worry about how kids behave. And that's because kids can be really scary and intimidating. and they can trigger every last one of our buttons. And like it's scary when they're out of control. You know, I always tell my own students, like my scariest memories of early life as a fourth grade teacher were definitely those like giant management concerns with kids just like talking over me all the time and like throwing Doritos across the room. And, you know, and it is, um, it generates a true out of control and sort of incompetent set of feelings in a teacher. And I guess I would just say that to my mind, the biggest thing a teacher can do to help with that is to stop and think about like what exactly is that triggering for me as a person. You know, where is this going for me? What exactly am I scared is going to happen, and what does that mean to me? And then kind of thinking about that can allow a much more like human approach to the kids.
Yeah, you've given me a lot to think about right now, and I presume that that will be a lot for my students to think about as well. Something that I wanted to bring up was that sense of incompetence or worry. And what I've noticed, and some students have explicitly expressed, is especially when you're being observed, and that observation is real during pre-service teacher training, and to some degree real and to some degree imagined once they're in the field, where they are held hyper accountable. And what's seen as a good teacher might be that a classroom is running smoothly. So I think that a lot of students feel anxious, and in-service teachers as well. I know I felt this in my classroom, that if a student is screaming and crying every day and you are not able to um, get to them, maybe you're not able to connect with them such that they stop crying, that might look bad. And so I wonder, what is the goal? If it's not compliance, what is it that we're shooting for around social and emotional learning?
Yeah, so I guess I think there are two different parts to what you're asking. The first part is, you know, an observer of a pre-service teacher or a principal observing an in-service teacher um, who has a humane and reasonable lens is not going to fault a teacher for a child's crying, because that's not how emotions work. And I do think that teachers and pre-service teachers understandably worry about that more than it actually comes to fruition. Although I'm not saying that it never comes to fruition. But I think anyone who has worked with kids knows that kids cry, and it's hard sometimes and it's sad, but it's usually not as simple as it being like one person's fault for not solving a very specific problem. But the other part of what you're asking is more complicated, which is like what should be happening with emotional life in the classroom, right? And like if it's not compliance, if it's not sort of neat, tidy management, then what is it? And I think the answer to that really is like humanism is being human together. I think the classrooms where I've seen the kids feel the most sort of seen and understood and, you know, I guess really supported are classrooms where the teacher is able to let go of some of that rigidity and just be alongside the kids and to say, you know, I do some research with one teacher who is just really good at saying like, these are the things we have to get done today. And we do have to get them done. And some of these things like, you know, are really important. And others of them, maybe I would, I mean, she doesn't say this outright, but she expresses it. Maybe I would drop them off a cliff too. Like, I don't love, you know, whatever the worksheet is we have to complete. But like, I'm here with you. You're going to be grumpy sometimes. It's okay. You might bicker with each other. It's okay. None of that uh, means that you're doing something like wrong in a moral sense. I think it's really nice when kids know that teachers are on their side, but for teachers to be on their side, teachers have to feel supported too, right? Or else teachers end up taking out like whatever aggression or resentment we have towards our administrators, and we end up taking them out on the kids because it's basically sort of a pecking order phenomenon. I think kids get angry a lot, and kids get really, really sad a lot, and kids feel jealous and terrified and worried and resentful and sort of all the big things that that any people feel. And I guess to me, um, just recognizing that and recognizing that there are completely justifiable reasons for that. And I'm not even talking about like big socio-political reasons, although those reasons too, but I'm more just talking about like the reason of like being a person in the world, right? Like people get angry, people get mad, they have outbursts, they do all those things, they fight with each other. And I think just allowing for some amount of that in a classroom generates this very human buzz that then really does allow for learning and growth and play and all of those things. And sometimes it looks a lot less tidy, but the feelings that come out of that are sort of much more likely to be feelings of fundamental camaraderie than sort of authoritative resentment.
So I want to pull a few things out from what you were saying. And it sounds like in this process of negotiating limits with children, that you're suggesting a real vulnerability on the part of the teacher. And what it sounds like you're saying is that rather than the goal to be compliance, you're prioritizing building that camaraderie, prioritizing building that relationship. Is that an accurate understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so. I guess I would say the caveat to that being when I say camaraderie, I don't mean that like teachers and their students are going to be like best friends by the end of the year. I mean, sometimes that kind of thing happens and sometimes it doesn't. It's not, I mean, that's just going to depend so much on the individuals and the exact circumstances. But camaraderie in the sense of like a functional group, you know, where people are kind of not just constantly enraged at each other and trying to suppress it. Yeah, I do think that's a basic goal. And I have seen and been in a lot of classrooms where the mandate for management leads to this sort of palpable sense that everybody hates everybody else. And that I actually just think is like really not conducive to um, kids feeling kind of basically okay about going to school. Nobody likes to feel like their teacher hates them.
Thank you for that. There's another piece of your work that I think is really valuable in thinking about how to approach children's emotions and what they bring up in us as the teacher. And that's this piece that you talk about of emotions being social and cultural. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and why that matters.
Yeah, so I mean, a tiny little story about that is that my very first teaching experiences were in Eastern Russia. I was in the Peace Corps after college, and I taught for many years in like K through 12 schools. And in Russian, they have a sort of a common we call it like a slogan that "Улыбка знак дурака," and it means a smile is a sign of a fool. And a lot, I mean, I'm not saying all Russians are like this, but a lot of the people I was friends with there would say, like, you Americans, you're so dumb. You go around smiling all the time. And it was really, I mean, I was young at the time. It was very it affected me deeply because it was kind of my first overt experience with the idea that kind of the things that I thought of as just like kind of basic rules of behavior and emotions and emotional expression were actually completely culturally informed. And obviously, like to generalize about Americans that way is ridiculous. To generalize about Russians that way is just as ridiculous. But this idea that sort of the thing that we should feel is a certain thing, it's a cultural thing and it's historical. It develops over time. It varies tremendously among subcultures. So just like all the things that teachers learn, you know, behaviorally, like sort of making eye contact, all of those things that are that can be like deeply culturally inscribed. Well, the same is true about emotion, right? And so um it is the case that in the United States, historically, we have prioritized this kind of positive affect, this idea that people should be basically happy most of the time. And that if they're not, like it's a big problem, right? But that's not like set in stone. There's no reason, there's no logical reason other than sort of um, that it's kind of iterated over time, that's repeated itself again and again over time, that should be true. And one thing that I hear teachers say a lot is that if kids aren't happy, they can't learn. And I just think that like, and that is like one of those things that neuroscience has accidentally contributed to by sort of the way that some brain research has been like misappropriated and misused in education. So if you stop and think about that for just 1 minute in the context of like all of human history, it's easy to see why that's not true, right? Because if you just think about like any moment in history that people have not been happy and yet have learned tremendous amounts, like I'm sure anyone could pull out like 100 examples, right? You can't say that somebody can only learn when they feel happy or comfortable or calm, or else nobody would ever learn if they were in some sort of like traumatic or difficult situation. And if that were true, like history would never evolve. So yeah, I think it is really important to remember that every kind of statement we would have about a certain feeling carries all this cultural baggage. So like again, I'm sorry, I'm being long-winded about this, but like if you take sort of a feeling like fear or sadness and think like, what are all the things that I associate with that feeling? What does it do to me? What are the times I've felt it? And then what are the messages I've gotten from like media, school, family, religion about that feeling? And how does that intersect with and not intersect with like my true inner experience and thinking about that feeling? I think sometimes just going through that mind exercise can be a useful way to understand, for example, that when a kid is really sad, they might be working something really important out. The goal might not be to get them happy again, but just to let them kind of live through that sadness.
I think that there's some powerful questions that come up there, which is when our focus is on happiness, who gets left out? Who are the children who are most affected by that, and who doesn't have the opportunity to work through those important things that they're working through in the classroom that are intimately connected to learning? I love the example that you brought up of eye contact, because I think that there's a possibility of marrying really your approach to social emotional learning with culturally sustaining practices that students may be learning about, where we're thinking about allowing children to maintain their emotions in their own right and display their emotions in ways that naturally come up, and recognizing that when a student doesn't make eye contact, that affects us in a certain way, but that might be really important to their way of being in the classroom. Another piece that I thought was really important was you brought up whether the goal is happiness. And I think traditionally, especially in inclusion classrooms aimed at this level of peacefulness, and where there is special education services are being employed in the classroom, that the idea of normalcy that we're working towards looks like a certain thing. And normalcy likely doesn't look like students acting out. It looks like the ideal student who is sitting and listening to the teacher and looks like they're listening in a particular way. And I think really one of the promises of your work and others who are using what are psychoanalytic ideas in the classroom is that the approach to normalcy can be really different. Like Donald and Claire Winnicott wrote about normalcy as being able to live in and participate in the world without being guided by anxiety or fear or guilt. And I wonder whether it is making students feel guilty for their emotions, or making them feel like those emotions aren't okay, is actually not healthy, or actually not helping them participate in the world.
I definitely think there's something to that. I mean, with the caveat that I guess what happens in school is ultimately a small part of a kid's day, and I guess it's important for teachers to remember that too. But yes, I do think that there is a tendency to sort of not explicitly, but implicitly render certain emotions shameful in schools. And I think that's probably particularly true of stuff like anger that gets associated with aggression or acting out. And, that is a really hard thing because the things that people do when they're angry can be threatening to the order of things. And yet, even something very simple, like a really simple explanation to a child, and by explanation I mean sort of verbally and by modeling that like anger itself is not just okay but inevitable, and it's kind of what we do with the anger, kind of the basic statement is what you do with the anger that can really make a difference. And then even then, and sometimes you're going to mess that up too. And like, that's also okay. Kind of taking that to its real extreme is very important. I mean, I think that the things that get asked of children vis-a-vis those kinds of strong feelings like anger really can be destructive. And some kids are more susceptible to that than others. And that's also important to remember and kind of try to be alert to as teachers. But yeah, and I mean, I should also put this caveat. I was thinking about this when you were talking before that, like, I struggle with this stuff all the time. Like, I don't like it when kids are sad. Like, I always want to cheer them up, Like, I don't like it when people are mad at me. Like, that stuff is hard. But I think kind of just like leaning into that challenge is actually an obligation of teachers, right? And simultaneously acknowledging that it's not a sort of thing that we complete, right? It's part of just this constant growth towards being people, being people together with children who are also people.
Yeah, I love this emphasis on being people and figuring out how we're living together in the world, because that way of negotiating relationships, it honestly doesn't sound that different from how I negotiate a relationship with one of my friends or a family member or a classmate or a colleague, in that, of course, we have a different relationship to the students in our classroom and we have different goals. But I think that's the piece that's really liberatory, as you said, use that word liberatory, where you're just figuring out how to live with each other, recognizing that you each have emotional responses to each other and being in the classroom.
Right. Like I guess I think that's, for me it is liberatory, this idea that like for some reason we have, it's important for teachers to be professional. And there's been this huge move towards professionalizing teaching. And there are good reasons for that. And the downside of it is that it really does start to impose these deeply unrealistic and suppressive and disturbing expectations on teachers, right? That like somehow because you're in this professional role, you ought not to feel or do the things that you do in every other part of your life. But like, if you really stop and think about that for a second, there's something like just silly about it. And that's true of like all professions, right? It's not like, how many of you have been to a doctor who like your doctor does something like a little bit weird or like seems upset or grumpy or, they're running late and they're flustered or whatever the thing is, think about like, um, I don't know. I'm just thinking about like sort of every profession that we interface with. Yes, there are boundaries and there are expectations around it. And there's the expectation that like you think about the things, right? Like, and I guess that's the other side of it is I think that teachers, like I'm saying all these things. And then the other part of it is ideally there's an obligation to reflect on that, right? So I get angry and I like lose it at a group of kids. I yell at them or I go over the top to cheer them up because like I can't stand the fact that they're just like really sad and grumpy about this lesson. And then I stop and think about that later, right? Because that's important too. Or I talk to somebody about it, or I think like, what was really going on with me when that happened? Not necessarily with the eye towards making sure that never happened again, but to try to achieve some kind of understanding that's then going to enable you to go back to those kids with the understanding that like that's what's going on for you in that relationship, right? um I mean, this is like so concrete, but I used to teach this kid years ago, a fifth grader, who just reminded me in every way of my little sister, like in every way. And I mean, I do think most examples of this kind of thing are less concrete than this, but this is just like maybe a helpful analogy for some people. Um, and like I would treat her sometimes like I would find myself saying things to her that like I would say to my little sister, you know? And then it was like, what am I doing here? Why am I like jealous and competing with this kid, this fifth grader? You know, I'm like 26, right? Then I'm like, why was I grumpy that like she finished the reading assignment before everybody else, right? And I'm like hoping my sister doesn't watch this video, but whatever. That's not the point. The point is like, so okay, so that happens, right? Stuff like that happens every minute in teaching because that is our unconscious. That's what we're bringing to um, all of our life is like those key relationships that really inform who we are. Then I stop and think about it and I see like, oh gosh, that was like when I got sort of like irritated with her for finishing that reading assignment early. That was partly me getting irritated at Ava, and it was partly me getting irritated at like my sister from 20 years ago who, you know, whatever, read my homework assignment when she was 5 years younger than me and made me feel stupid or whatever the thing is, right? Everybody has a million things like that. And again, the idea not being like, oh, now it's okay to go around treating our students like our sisters or our parents or our like boyfriends or whatever the thing is. But the idea being that stuff like that is going to happen whether it's okay or not. And if we try to suppress that from happening, we actually do it times like 50 and it gets actually more aggressive and more angry and we feel more resentful and we never really take the time to think about what's happening in those encounters.
Yeah, I love that example. I think what it brings up is shifting away from our obligation in SEL to just be teaching how to feel and how to act towards an obligation of reflexivity to recognize how it is that implicitly we are also teaching children how to act because of our own feelings that are coming up. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
and I would say, wait, sorry, just one thing
that's
about the
okay.
reflexivity, because I do think that's really important. And what's extra hard about it is that, like, um, I mean, in Massachusetts, at least, you know, when my students are observed during their pre-service teaching, they have to fill out a reflection form after every observation, and like that reflexivity, it is sort of built into the professionalization, and it's always the reflection form is always like, you know, did I meet the lesson objectives? Did I meet the you know, whatever, like the elements that I'm supposed to be assessed based on? And I guess I think that like even the word reflexivity has been appropriated by professionalization discourse in this way that can be a little destructive. And so it's almost like I don't even like to use that word. I just like to say like, and then just think about it later. Then just like talk to your best friend about it later. Then just take a minute to like note it in yourself later. Like don't even call it a reflection. Just think about it. Just think about it for a minute.
I love that. I think it's very concrete to walk away with that anything that comes up, be it conflict, I think, or something that feels really good. A lot of our conversation has reflected or surrounded conflict and negative emotions. And I think that's really important because it comes up. I also think of equal importance is to consider those times that we're caught up in something that's really exciting to us. Who are the students that we're drawn to? Who are we really paying attention to, and why that might matter in the context of this group trying to live together?
Yeah, that's really true. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on social and emotional learning and these really practical ideas about what we're working towards and how we negotiate limits and living together in the classroom.
Oh, thanks for listening. It was really fun.